In 1993, a geneticist named Dean Hamer published a study suggesting there was a stretch of DNA on the X chromosome, a region called XQ28, that appeared in higher rates among gay men than straight men. Headlines immediately declared the discovery of the gay gene. Within a few years, the study had been scrutinized, partially replicated, partially challenged, and thoroughly The gene, as a simple singular explanation, didn't hold up. What the research actually found was something more interesting and more difficult: that sexual orientation has a biological basis that's real, heritable, and genuinely hard to explain. That last part, the hard to explain part, is where the science gets compelling, because homosexuality poses one of the more interesting puzzles in evolutionary biology, and the attempts to solve it have produced some of the more counterintuitive ideas in the field. The puzzle starts with a basic observation. Homosexuality appears in every human culture ever studied, in every time period for which we have records, at a relatively consistent rate of somewhere between 2 and 10% of the population, depending on how it's measured and defined. It also appears in hundreds of non-human animal species, including bonobos, dolphins, penguins, giraffes, rams, and fruit flies, which suggests it's not a cultural artifact or a product of modern social conditions. This creates a genuine evolutionary question. Natural selection favors traits that increase reproductive success. Same-sex sexual behavior, at least in a direct sense, doesn't produce offspring. If it's partly heritable, which the data suggest it is, you'd expect selection pressure to work against it over time. And yet it persists, across species, across millennia, at stable rates. Something is maintaining it. Several hypotheses have been proposed, and none has been definitively proven, which is worth stating up front. These are frameworks that fit the evidence with varying degrees of completeness. The most widely discussed is kin selection, sometimes called the gay uncle hypothesis. The idea has roots in work by E. O. Wilson and others, and it runs like this. Natural selection doesn't only operate through direct reproduction. It also operates through the reproduction of close relatives who share your genes. Helping a sibling raise children who share half your DNA can, in genetic terms, be almost as effective as having children yourself. The hypothesis proposes that individuals with same-sex orientation may have historically invested more resources in nieces, nephews, and other family members, including food, protection, childcare, and teaching, and that this indirect reproductive contribution was sufficient to maintain the relevant genes in the population. The individual doesn't reproduce directly, but their genetic material passes through the family line anyway. There's some supporting evidence. Studies in Samoa, where feminine males called fa'afafun are a recognized social category, found that fa'afafun showed significantly higher avuncular investment, meaning more time, attention, and resources directed towards siblings' children than either heterosexual men or heterosexual women. A few other cross-cultural studies have found similar patterns. The evidence is suggestive but not yet conclusive, and the hypothesis has critics who point out that the magnitude of the effect may not be large enough to account for the genetic maintenance of the trait. A second hypothesis focuses on what happens in the female line. Andrea Campari-Oceani, an Italian researcher, published work in the early 2000s suggesting that genes associated with male homosexuality might increase fertility in women who carry them. His team found that maternal female relatives of gay men, including mothers, aunts, and maternal grandmothers, had significantly more children on average than maternal female relatives of straight men. The genes, in other words, might be maintained in the population because they confer a reproductive advantage when expressed in women, even if they're associated with reduced direct reproduction when expressed in men. This is called sexually antagonistic selection, and it's not unique to humans as a mechanism. It appears in other species as a way traits that seem disadvantageous in one sex persist because they're advantageous in the other. The math can work out to net positive selection, even if the direct reproductive cost in one sex is real. Campari-Oceani's findings have been partially replicated and partially challenged. As with most findings in this area, the picture is incomplete. A third line of evidence comes from a more unexpected direction: birth order. Ray Blanchard, a researcher at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, documented what's now called the fraternal birth order effect. The finding is that each older biological brother a man has increases his probability of being gay by roughly 33%. Having one older brother doesn't dramatically change the odds. Having 4 or 5 starts to make a measurable difference at the population level. The effect is specific. It's biological brothers, not adopted brothers or older sisters, that produce it. The leading explanation is immunological. During pregnancy with a male fetus, the mother is exposed to Y-linked proteins. With each subsequent male pregnancy, her immune response to these proteins strengthens. The hypothesis is that this maternal immune response gradually affects the prenatal development of the brain in later-born sons in ways that influence sexual orientation. This wouldn't explain all or even most male homosexuality. Most gay men don't have multiple older brothers, but it appears to account for a real fraction of cases and has been replicated across multiple studies in different countries. It's one of the more robust empirical findings in the field. What all of this research collectively suggests is that there isn't one mechanism. Sexual orientation appears to be influenced by a combination of genetic factors, prenatal hormonal environment, maternal immune responses, and probably other variables not yet identified. The simple single-cause model, the gay gene as headline writers wanted, doesn't describe the biology accurately. The actual picture is a set of overlapping mechanisms that each contribute something, operating in a context where the evolutionary accounting is more complex than it first appears. The history of how human cultures have understood and organized same-sex behavior is just as complicated and just as far from the simple narrative that gets taught. The ancient Greeks are the example everyone reaches for, usually with some version of the claim that ancient Greece was unusually tolerant of homosexuality. The reality is more specific and more interesting than that. What ancient Greek culture formalized was not homosexuality as a category of identity, since that concept didn't exist yet, but a set of age-structured relationships between men. The Eraser Romanos model involved an older man, typically in his 20s or 30s, and a younger male, typically an adolescent, in a relationship that combined mentorship, social initiation, and erotic elements. The older man pursued, the younger received courtship. The relationship was expected to end when the younger man reached adulthood. These relationships were neither universal nor obligatory, but they were socially recognized and in elite circles especially idealized. What mattered to Greek thinking was not the gender of the partners, but the roles they occupied. The active position was associated with masculinity and social superiority. The passive position was associated with femininity and social inferiority. An adult male citizen taking the passive role was considered degraded, not because of the gender of his partner, but because of what the role implied about his status. The categories organizing the behavior were power and age, not gender in the modern sense. This produced some striking specific manifestations. The Sacred Band of Thebes, formed in 378 BCE, was an elite military unit of 150 pairs of male lovers. The reasoning was that men would fight harder beside their lovers than beside strangers. The Sacred Band was undefeated for decades until it was destroyed by Philip of Macedon at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Philip reportedly wept when he saw the bodies. All 300 had died in formation rather than retreat. Plato's Symposium contains Aristophanes' famous speech proposing that humans were originally beings of three types: male-male, female-female, and male-female, who were split apart by the gods. Each type now seeks its original other half. It's one of the earliest attempts to explain sexual variation through something like a naturalistic framework, and it's notable for treating all three types as equally valid expressions of the original whole. Rome is more complex still. Romans inherited Greek cultural frameworks, but applied them in a context shaped by Roman values, and those values centered intensely on the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, dominants and subordinates. For Roman men, what mattered was not the gender of one's sexual partners, but whether one occupied the active or passive role. A Roman citizen taking the active role with another man, particularly a slave, a foreigner, or a prostitute, was not thought to have compromised his masculinity at all. Taking the passive role, regardless of the partner's gender, was considered degrading for a citizen. The legal term pathicus referred to a citizen male who took the passive role and was subject to social and sometimes legal sanction. Julius Caesar was mocked throughout his career with a story that he had been the lover of King Nicomedes of Bithynia as a young man in the passive role. His enemies never let it go. He was referred to as every woman's husband and every man's wife. Caesar apparently found the Nicomedes references more infuriating than any other criticism he faced in a career full of political enemies. The Emperor Hadrian's relationship with a young Greek man named Antinous is among the most documented love affairs of the ancient world. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 CE under circumstances never fully explained, Hadrian's grief was extravagant even by imperial standards. He founded a city on the site, had Antinous deified, erected statues of him across the empire. More statues than survive of any ancient individual except Augustus, and reportedly wept openly in public, which Roman commentators considered excessive and slightly embarrassing. Elsewhere, the picture varies in ways that resist easy generalization. In ancient China, same-sex relationships between men appear throughout literary and historical records under a set of poetic names. The Passion of the Cut Sleeve comes from a story about Emperor A of Han who cut off his sleeve rather than wake his sleeping male lover when he needed to rise in the morning. The Bitten Peach comes from another historical anecdote. These phrases entered the language as conventional euphemisms. Imperial China produced no consistent persecution of same-sex behavior between men. Attitudes shifted across dynasties, with some periods of relative acceptance and others of more restrictive norms. In Japan, particularly among samurai and Buddhist monks, relationships between adult men and adolescent male apprentices followed patterns structurally similar to the Greek Eraser Romanos model, with similar emphasis on age hierarchy and mentorship alongside erotic elements. The tradition called Shudo, or Nanshoku, was extensively documented in literature and considered compatible with and sometimes even emblematic of samurai virtue. In many pre-colonial indigenous cultures across North America, individuals who occupied gender roles outside the male-female binary were recognized within community structures. The contemporary umbrella term Two-Spirit, adopted in 1990 by indigenous activists, covers a range of traditions that varied significantly between nations. These traditions were not simply about same-sex attraction, they involved distinct social roles, spiritual functions, and community relationships. Collapsing them into modern Western categories obscures more than it reveals, but they document that the organization of gender and sexuality outside binary norms was not unusual in human social history. It was common. What emerges from both the biology and the history is a picture that doesn't fit cleanly into any simple story. The evolutionary evidence suggests that same-sex orientation is maintained by mechanisms that are genuinely complex, possibly multiple overlapping genetic and developmental pathways, with effects that vary by sex, birth order, and probably environmental factors not yet understood. The idea that it's a defect, an error, or an anomaly to be explained away doesn't survive contact with the data. Something is maintaining it, and the hypotheses about what that something is are all more interesting than the anomaly framing suggests. The historical evidence suggests that the categories we use today, including homosexuality, heterosexuality, and sexual identity, are relatively recent inventions. For most of human history, people organize same-sex behavior through frameworks built around age, status, role, and social function rather than the gender of one's partners as a primary axis of identity. That doesn't mean same-sex attraction didn't exist. The behavior is everywhere in the record. It means the meaning attached to it was constructed differently, and the constructions were diverse enough that no single ancient attitude toward it can be identified. The consistent thread is that same-sex behavior is part of the human behavioral repertoire across every culture and period where we have detailed evidence. What changes is what people make of it.